What if your whole community thought your dead husband was a thief, but you knew there was more to the story? Sarah Mackenzie stood at the edge of her husband's fresh grave, dirt still dark and loose beneath the simple wooden cross. The October wind cut through Copper Valley like a blade, but it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was the eyes, dozens of them watching her from a distance, whispering behind gloved hands. "Cattle thief," she heard someone mutter. "Should have known Tom Mackenzie was no good," came another voice. But what they didn't know, what nobody in that God-forsaken valley knew, was that Tom Mackenzie had been murdered for trying to expose the truth. And the real thieves, they were standing right there in the crowd, dressed in their Sunday best, shaking their heads in mock disapproval. Sarah pulled her black shawl tight around her shoulders and glanced down at her two children. Little Emma, only 6, clutched her rag doll with dirt-stained fingers. 9-year-old Billy tried to look brave, but his bottom lip trembled as he watched the townspeople turn their backs on his family. The funeral was ending, but Sarah's nightmare was just beginning. Because in 3 days, Sheriff Morton would be riding out to seize her cattle, her land, and everything Tom had worked his whole life to build. The community had already decided. The Mackenzie family were outcasts, and there was no place for them in Copper Valley. But justice has a way of finding the most unlikely champions. And sometimes the truth comes riding into town wearing a badge and carrying secrets that will shake a community to its very foundation. This is the story of a widow who refused to let her husband's name be buried with lies. A story of honor, betrayal, and the kind of courage that can only be found when everything you love is on the line. The first stone hit Sarah's kitchen window 3 days after Tom's funeral. She was stirring a thin pot of beans, the last of what they had, when the crack echoed through the small cabin. Emma screamed, and Billy jumped up from the wooden table where he'd been struggling with his arithmetic. "Mama," Emma whispered, her blue eyes wide with terror. Sarah set down the wooden spoon and walked to the window. Through the spider web of broken glass, she could see 3 figures on horseback silhouetted against the evening sky. One of them leaned over and spat into the dust before wheeling his horse around and riding off. "It's all right, sweetheart," Sarah lied, pulling Emma close. "Just some boys being foolish." But it wasn't boys, and they both knew it. Those were grown men, ranchers and townspeople who had once tipped their hats when she walked down Main Street. Now they treated her family like they carried the plague. The accusations had started 2 weeks before Tom died. Cattle had been disappearing from ranches all around Copper Valley. Dozens of heads stolen in the dead of night, brands altered, animals sold to Army contracts 3 counties over. When Tom's horse came back without him, and they found his body at the bottom of Devil's Canyon with a bullet in his back, Sheriff Morton had been quick to close the case. "Rustling partners had a falling out," Morton had declared. "Tom Mackenzie got what was coming to him." The evidence seemed damning. Strange cattle had been found on Mackenzie property, animals with altered brands that clearly belonged to other ranchers. Witnesses claimed they'd seen Tom meeting with suspicious characters near the old mining camp. Money had even been found hidden in their barn, more cash than a small rancher should have. But Sarah knew her husband. Tom Mackenzie was many things: stubborn, proud, sometimes too quick with his fists. But he was no thief. He'd worked 16-hour days to build their small ranch, had never taken so much as an extra apple from Morrison's orchard without paying for it. "Mama, I'm hungry," Emma whispered. Sarah looked down at her daughter's pale face and felt her heart crack a little more. The beans in the pot would barely feed them tonight, and tomorrow there would be even less. The general store had cut off their credit. The neighbors who used to help during hard times now crossed the street to avoid her. Even the church had made it clear that the Mackenzie family was no longer welcome. "I know, baby girl. We'll eat soon." Billy stood up from the table, his young face set with determination that reminded Sarah painfully of his father. "I could go hunting, Mama. Pa taught me how to use the rifle." "No." Sarah's voice was sharper than she intended. "You're not to leave this property, Billy Mackenzie. Not until—" She stopped herself. "Until what? Until the truth came out? Until Sheriff Morton decided to do his job properly? Until the real thieves confessed?" A knock at the door made them all freeze. Sarah moved slowly toward the entrance, her hand instinctively reaching for the shotgun Tom had mounted above the fireplace. In Copper Valley these days, Unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. Mrs. Mackenzie? The voice was unfamiliar, deep with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas or maybe Oklahoma. My name's Jack Brennan. I'm the new sheriff. Sarah frowned. Sheriff Morton had been the law in Copper Valley for nearly 8 years. What happened to Sheriff Morton? Territorial governor reassigned him. Mind if I come in? I'd like to ask you a few questions about your husband's death. Sarah hesitated. The last time a lawman had asked her questions, it had ended with Tom being branded a cattle thief. But something in this man's tone was different. Respectful, patient. She opened the door. Sheriff Jack Brennan was tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair and eyes the color of winter sky. His clothes were dusty from travel, but his badge was polished bright. Most importantly, he removed his hat when he saw her, a courtesy that Sheriff Morton had abandoned after the accusations began. "Ma'am," he said with a slight nod, "I apologize for calling so late, but I wanted to speak with you before word got around town that I was here." Why would that matter? Brennan glanced around the small cabin, taking in the broken window, the meager meal cooling on the stove, the children's frightened faces. "Because I've been reading through the case file on your husband's death, and I have some concerns about how the investigation was handled." Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. What kind of concerns? The kind that keep an honest lawman awake at night. Brennan's eyes met hers. "Mrs. Mackenzie, I've been tracking cattle thieves for the better part of 10 years. I know how they operate, how they think, how they cover their tracks. And nothing about your husband's case makes sense." Billy stepped forward, his young voice trembling with emotion. "You mean Pa wasn't a thief?" Brennan knelt down to Billy's eye level. "Son, I can't make any promises yet, but I can promise you this. I'm going to find out what really happened to your father. And if he was innocent, the whole valley's going to know it." Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time since the funeral. "Sheriff, the whole community believes—" "Communities can be wrong, ma'am. I've seen it before." Brennan stood and walked to the broken window, examining the shattered glass. "Who did this?" "I don't know. It happened tonight." "Any threats? Anyone tell you to leave town?" Sarah hesitated. There had been whispered warnings at the general store, cold stares at church, the banker's suggestion that she might be happier somewhere else, but nothing direct. Nothing she could prove. "Not exactly," she said. Brennan nodded as if he understood. "Mrs. Mackenzie, I need to ask you about the cattle that were found on your property, the ones with the altered brands. Tom said he'd never seen them before. He found them in our north pasture one morning, mixed in with our stock. He was planning to ride into town and report it, but—" She gestured helplessly. "But he was killed first." Brennan pulled out a small notebook and made a note. "What about the money Sheriff Morton found in your barn?" "We never saw that money until Morton found it. Tom and I counted every penny we had. We were struggling to make ends meet. If there had been extra money, we would have spent it on feed for the winter." "Did your husband mention seeing anything strange in the weeks before his death? Riders where they shouldn't be? Cattle moving at odd times?" Sarah thought back, trying to remember. Tom had been worried about something those last few weeks, but he'd always been protective of her and the children. He hadn't wanted to frighten them with talk of troubles. "He said something about tracks," she said slowly, "in the mud near Willow Creek. Said they didn't make sense. Too many horses for the number of cattle that had been moved." Brennan looked up sharply. "Did he show you these tracks?" "Number, he said he was going to investigate further, but then—" Sarah's voice trailed off. "Then he was found dead." Brennan closed his notebook. "Mrs. Mackenzie, I want you to know that I don't believe your husband was involved in any cattle rustling, but proving his innocence is going to take time, and it might be dangerous. There are people in this valley who benefit from Tom Mackenzie being blamed for these thefts." Emma tugged at Sarah's skirt. "Mama, does this mean people will like us again?" Sarah looked down at her daughter's hopeful face and felt her heart break anew. "We'll see, sweetheart." Brennan reached into his coat and pulled out a small pouch of coins. "This should help with supplies for a few days. And Mrs. Mackenzie?" He paused at the door. "If anyone bothers you, anyone at all, You send Billy to find me at the hotel. I don't care what time of day or night it is." After he left, Sarah sank into Tom's old chair by the fireplace and allowed herself to cry. For the first time in weeks, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of possibility. Outside, the wind continued to howl through Copper Valley, but inside the Mackenzie cabin, Hope had finally found a place to rest. Billy sat down beside her, his small hand finding hers. "Do you think Sheriff Brennan can really help us, Mama?" Sarah squeezed her son's fingers and looked toward the door where their unlikely savior had disappeared into the darkness. "I think," she said softly, "we're about to find out just how deep the truth is buried in this valley." What she didn't know was that someone had been watching from the shadows as Sheriff Brennan left their cabin. Someone who had a very good reason to want Tom Mackenzie's reputation to stay buried along with his body. The real game was just beginning, and Sarah Mackenzie was about to discover that in Copper Valley, the most dangerous enemies were the ones who smiled at you in church and shook your hand on Sunday morning. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, and with them, the terrible knowledge that her husband had died not because he was a thief, but because he was getting too close to exposing the biggest cattle rustling operation the territory had ever seen. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, the Mackenzie family would sleep without fear, because justice, it seemed, had finally come to Copper Valley, and it was carrying a badge. Sheriff Jack Brennan was up before dawn, his boots hitting the dusty floorboards of the hotel room as the first pale light crept through the thin curtains. He'd spent half the night going through Sheriff Morton's case files, and what he'd found, or rather, what he hadn't found, made his jaw clench with professional anger. Morton's investigation had been sloppy at best, deliberately misleading at worst. Critical evidence had been ignored, witnesses hadn't been properly questioned, and the physical evidence had been collected in a way that would make any competent lawman suspicious. Brennan strapped on his gun belt and headed downstairs. The hotel lobby was empty except for a sleepy desk clerk who barely looked up as the sheriff passed. Outside, Copper Valley was still wrapped in the gray silence of early morning, but Brennan could already see smoke rising from chimneys as the town began to stir. His first stop was the livery stable. "Help you, Sheriff?" The stable master, a grizzled man named Pete Hawkins, emerged from a stall with a pitchfork in his hands. His tone was neutral, but his eyes were curious. "I need to examine Tom Mackenzie's horse," Brennan said. "The one that came back without him." Pete's expression darkened. "Sheriff Morton already looked that animal over. Said there wasn't nothing to see." "I'd like to see for myself." Pete shrugged and led him to a stall near the back of the stable. Inside stood a bay gelding, well-muscled but showing signs of hard use. Brennan ran his hands over the animal's flanks, checking for injuries, examining the saddle marks, studying the wear patterns on the hooves. "This horse has been ridden hard recently," Brennan observed. "More than just the day Tom Mackenzie died." "Horse gets ridden hard sometimes," Pete said defensively. "That's what horses are for." But Brennan was examining the animal's legs more closely. There, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, were scratches and cuts that suggested the horse had been ridden through rough terrain. Brambles, maybe. Or the rocky area near Devil's Canyon where Tom's body had been found. "Pete, tell me something. When this horse came back, was the saddle still on?" "Course it was. Why wouldn't it be?" "And the reins?" Pete hesitated. "Well, they were kind of tangled up, like the horse had been running free for a while." Brennan nodded, filing that information away. A spooked horse would run with reins trailing, but those reins would get caught on brush, rocks, fence posts. If the reins were merely tangled, rather than torn or broken, it suggested the horse hadn't been running wild for very long. His next stop was more challenging, the north pasture of the Mackenzie Ranch, where the stolen cattle had allegedly been found. Sarah Mackenzie was hanging laundry on a line behind her cabin when Brennan rode up. The morning sun caught the gold highlights in her brown hair, and for a moment he was struck by how young she looked. Too young to be facing the troubles that had been heaped on her family. "Sheriff," she said, pausing in her work, "I wasn't expecting you back so soon. Mrs. Mackenzie, I need to examine the area where those cattle were found. Would you mind showing me?" Sarah glanced toward the cabin where her children were visible through the window, eating breakfast. "Of course. Billy can watch Emma for a few minutes." They walked together across the brown grass of the pasture, their boots crunching on frost-dried weeds. Sarah pointed to a fenced area near a small stream. This is where Sheriff Morton said they found the cattle with the altered brands. Tom's cattle usually graze closer to the cabin, where we can keep an eye on them. Brennan knelt and examined the ground. Even after several weeks, he could still make out the signs of multiple animals having been held in this area. But something wasn't right about the pattern of tracks and droppings. Mrs. Mackenzie, how many head of cattle does your family usually run? About 30 head. Tom was hoping to build the herd up to 50 over the next few years. Brennan studied the ground more carefully. The signs suggested that many more animals had been in this pasture, perhaps 60 or 70 head. That meant the stolen cattle had significantly outnumbered the Mackenzie family's legitimate stock. Tell me about the day your husband found these animals. What exactly did he say? Sarah wrapped her arms around herself against the morning chill. He came in for breakfast, all upset and confused. Said there were strange cattle mixed in with ours, and he didn't know how they'd gotten there. The brands looked wrong, like someone had used a running iron to change them. Did he recognize any of the original brands before they were altered? He thought some of them might have been from the Morrison Ranch, and maybe a few from the Triple R spread, but he wasn't certain. The alterations made it hard to tell. Brennan walked in a slow circle around the area, reading the signs in the earth like a book. The more he saw, the more convinced he became that Tom Mackenzie had been framed. Mrs. Mackenzie, I need to ask you something that might be difficult. Did your husband have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to hurt him or your family? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant. Tom could be stubborn. He didn't always get along with some of the bigger ranchers. They thought he was too small-time, not worth their respect. Anyone specific? Well, Frank Morrison was always trying to buy our land. Said a small ranch like ours couldn't survive the hard winters. Tom refused to sell. This land has been in his family for 3 generations. Brennan made a mental note. Frank Morrison ran one of the largest cattle operations in the valley, and his brand had reportedly been found on some of the altered cattle. What about Sheriff Morton? How did he get along with your husband? Sarah's expression grew troubled. Not well, especially toward the end. Morton always seemed to side with the bigger ranchers when there were disputes. And lately, she hesitated. Go on. Tom said Morton had been asking a lot of questions about our finances. Wanted to know how we could afford to keep the ranch going through the bad times. It felt like he was looking for a reason to cause trouble. They were walking back toward the cabin when Sarah suddenly stopped and pointed to a cluster of trees near the property line. Sheriff, there's something else. After Tom died, I found something hidden in those trees. I probably should have mentioned it yesterday, but I wasn't sure if it was important. Brennan felt his pulse quicken. What kind of something? Papers. Tom had wrapped them in oilcloth and buried them under the old oak tree. I only found them because Emma's ball rolled over there, and I noticed the ground had been disturbed. Do you still have these papers? They're hidden in the cabin. I was afraid to keep them where anyone might find them. Inside the cabin, Sarah retrieved a small bundle from a loose floorboard beneath the kitchen table. The oilcloth wrapping had protected the contents from moisture, and when Brennan unfolded the papers, he found himself looking at evidence that could change everything. There were hand-drawn maps showing cattle movement patterns throughout the valley. Notes in Tom's careful handwriting documented suspicious activity. 15 head moved through Devil's Canyon at midnight. 3 riders. Army buyer paid twice what cattle were worth. No questions asked. Brands being altered at Old Henderson Place. But most damning of all was a list of names. Prominent ranchers and businessmen in Copper Valley, with notes about their potential involvement in the rustling operation. Frank Morrison's name was at the top of the list. Mrs. Mackenzie, Brennan said slowly, your husband wasn't involved in cattle rustling. He was investigating it. Sarah sank into a chair, her face pale. He was trying to catch the real thieves? More than that, according to these notes, he'd identified most of the operation. The altered brands, the buyers, even the routes they were using to move stolen cattle. Brennan looked up from the papers. This is why he was killed. He'd gotten too close to the truth. Billy appeared in the doorway, his young face eager. Does this mean Pa's not a thief? Your father was a hero, son. He died trying to protect this whole valley from criminals. But even as Brennan spoke the words, he was thinking about the implications. If Tom Mackenzie had been close to exposing a major rustling operation, then his murder was just the beginning. The people behind this would kill again to protect their secret. And that meant Sarah and her children were in more danger than any of them had realized. "Mrs. Mackenzie," Brennan said, carefully folding the papers, "I need you to pack some things for you and the children. Essential items only." "Why? What's wrong?" "Because when word gets out that I'm reopening this investigation, the people who killed your husband are going to come after anyone who might have evidence against them. And that includes his family." Sarah's eyes widened with fear, but her voice remained steady. "Where would we go?" "There's a safe house in the next county. My deputy can escort you there until this is finished." "No," Sarah's voice was firm. "I won't run. This is our home, our land. Tom died fighting for the truth, and I won't dishonor his memory by hiding." Brennan studied her face, the determined set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes that spoke of courage inherited through generations of frontier women. He recognized the look. It was the same expression he'd seen on his own mother's face when she'd refused to leave their ranch during Apache raids. "Mrs. Mackenzie, these are dangerous people. They've already killed once. Then help me protect my children and catch the bastards who murdered my husband." Despite the gravity of the situation, Brennan found himself smiling. Sarah Mackenzie might be young, and she might be outnumbered, but she had something that couldn't be bought or intimidated: the fierce determination of a woman defending her family. "All right," he said, "but we do this my way. No unnecessary risks, and you follow my instructions exactly." "Agreed." "Then let's go catch some cattle thieves." As they shook hands, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the hills above the Mackenzie ranch. Frank Morrison lowered his spyglass and turned his horse toward town, his mind already working on how to deal with this new threat. Sheriff Brennan might think he was clever, but Morrison had been running cattle, legitimate and otherwise, for 20 years. He'd dealt with suspicious lawmen before. This one would be no different. The game was about to get much more dangerous, and the stakes were higher than anyone in Copper Valley imagined. But Sarah Mackenzie and Sheriff Brennan were about to learn that sometimes the truth is worth any risk, even if it costs everything you have. Frank Morrison stood in the shadows of the Copper Valley Bank, his weathered hands gripping the reins of his horse as he watched Sheriff Brennan emerge from the Mackenzie cabin. The lawman's purposeful stride and the determined set of his shoulders told Morrison everything he needed to know. This wasn't going to be as easy as dealing with Sheriff Morton had been. Morrison spat into the dust and mounted his horse. He had work to do, and not much time to do it. Meanwhile, Sheriff Brennan was riding hard toward the old Henderson place, the abandoned ranch that Tom Mackenzie's notes had identified as a location where brands were being altered. The morning sun was climbing higher, burning off the frost and casting long shadows across the valley floor. The Henderson ranch had been deserted for 3 years, ever since old Pete Henderson had died and his children moved back east. The buildings were weathered and sagging, but they were isolated enough to provide perfect cover for illegal activities. Brennan approached carefully, his hand resting on his gun. The main house was clearly empty. Boards covered the windows and weeds grew up through the porch steps. But the barn was a different story. Fresh horse tracks led to and from the structure, and the ground around it was churned with the signs of recent activity. Inside the barn, Brennan found exactly what Tom Mackenzie's notes had described: a makeshift forge with running irons, the tools used to alter cattle brands. Fresh ashes in the fire pit suggested the equipment had been used recently. Scraps of burned hair and hide littered the floor, and the smell of scorched flesh still lingered in the air. But it was what he found in the corner that made Brennan's blood run cold: a pile of fresh hides bearing the original brands of stolen cattle. Morrison's Circle M brand appeared on at least a dozen hides, along with brands from the Triple R, the Lazy S, and several smaller ranches throughout the valley. "Damn," Brennan muttered, examining the evidence. This wasn't just casual rustling. This was an organized operation that had been systematically robbing the ranchers of Copper Valley for months, maybe years. He was photographing the brands with his camera when he heard the sound of approaching horses. Multiple riders coming fast. Brennan quickly gathered several of the branded hides and slipped out the back of the barn, making his way to where he'd hidden his horse in a grove of cottonwoods. From his concealed position, He watched as 4 men rode into the farmyard. He recognized Frank Morrison immediately. The big rancher's distinctive white hat and expensive saddle made him hard to miss. With him were 3 other men Brennan didn't recognize, but their hard faces and the casual way they wore their guns marked them as hired muscle. "Burn it," Morrison ordered, dismounting near the barn. "All of it. We can't risk anyone else finding this place." One of the men doused the barn with kerosene while another set fire to the pile of evidence inside. Within minutes, the entire structure was engulfed in flames. "What about the sheriff?" one of Morrison's men asked. "Brennan's asking too many questions," Morrison replied, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "And the Mackenzie woman has something that belongs to us. We need to deal with both problems. You want us to handle it tonight?" Morrison was quiet for a moment, watching the barn burn. "Number 2 obvious. We need to be smart about this. Make it look like an accident. Or better yet, make it look like they left town of their own accord." Brennan's jaw clenched as he listened to the men discuss the best ways to eliminate him and the Mackenzie family. He'd heard enough. Carefully, he began to back his horse away from the grove, but a dry branch snapped under the animal's hoof. "What was that?" one of Morrison's men called out. "Could be anything," Morrison said, but his hand was already moving toward his gun. "Jake, you and Torn check the tree line. Carlos, keep watch on the road." Brennan knew he had seconds before they found his hiding place. He spurred his horse forward, breaking from the trees at a full gallop, just as Jake rounded the grove with his pistol drawn. "There!" Jake shouted, firing a shot that whistled past Brennan's ear. The sheriff leaned low over his horse's neck and raced across the open ground toward the main road. Behind him, he could hear the thunder of hooves as Morrison's men gave chase. More shots rang out, but shooting accurately from the back of a running horse was nearly impossible. Brennan had 2 advantages. His horse was fresh, and he knew the terrain better than Morrison's hired guns. He guided his mount through a series of arroyos and dry creek beds that would make pursuit difficult, gradually working his way back toward town. It wasn't until he was within sight of Copper Valley's church steeple that he finally stopped to catch his breath. His horse was lathered with sweat, and his own heart was pounding from the adrenaline of the chase. But he had what he'd come for. Proof that Frank Morrison was running a major cattle rustling operation, and evidence that Tom Mackenzie had been murdered to keep him quiet. Now came the hard part, staying alive long enough to see justice done. Back at the Mackenzie ranch, Sarah was trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for her children, while her mind raced with worry about Sheriff Brennan. She'd sent Billy to gather eggs from the hen house and Emma to pick the last of the late vegetables from their small garden. She was mending one of Tom's old shirts. She couldn't bear to throw away his clothes yet when she heard riders approaching. Her blood chilled when she saw Frank Morrison leading 3 other men toward her cabin. Sarah quickly hid Tom's papers under a loose floorboard and grabbed the shotgun from above the fireplace. She'd grown up on the frontier and knew how to use it. "Mrs. Mackenzie," Morrison called out as he dismounted. His voice was friendly, but his eyes were cold as winter steel. "I hope you don't mind us stopping by. I wanted to offer my condolences on Tom's passing." "That's kind of you, Mr. Morrison," Sarah replied, keeping the shotgun low but ready. "But I think you already paid your respects at the funeral?" Morrison smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, I also wanted to discuss a business proposition. I know times are hard for you and the children, and I'd like to help." "What kind of help?" "I'd like to buy your ranch. I'm prepared to offer you a fair price. Enough to start a new life somewhere else. Somewhere you and the children would be safer." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah felt her grip tighten on the shotgun. "This ranch isn't for sale, Mr. Morrison. Tom built this place with his own hands, and it's our home." "Sarah, may I call you Sarah? You need to be practical. A woman alone with 2 young children can't run a cattle ranch. And with Tom's reputation..." Morrison shrugged eloquently. "Well, let's just say you'll find it difficult to get credit or hire help. The community has certain expectations." "You mean the community believes lies about my husband?" Morrison's expression hardened. Tom Mackenzie was caught red-handed with stolen cattle on his property. The evidence was overwhelming. "The evidence was planted," Sarah said firmly, "and I think you know that better than anyone." For a moment, Morrison's mask slipped, and Sarah saw the dangerous man beneath the polite facade. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Mackenzie. You should be careful about making enemies in this valley." "Is that a threat?" "It's friendly advice, from one neighbor to another." Billy chose that moment to come running around the corner of the cabin, a basket of eggs in his hands. He stopped short when he saw the group of armed men, his young face paling with fear. "Go inside, Billy," Sarah said quietly. "Take Emma with you." Morrison's eyes followed the boy with calculating interest. "Fine children. It would be a shame if anything happened to them." Sarah raised the shotgun, pointing it directly at Morrison's chest. "Get off my land." Morrison's men reached for their guns, but he held up a hand to stop them. "Now, Sarah, there's no need for violence. I'm just trying to help a widow in distress." "Help?" Sarah's voice was deadly quiet. "You call threatening my children help? I think you misunderstood." "I understood perfectly. Now get out, before I show you just how well my husband taught me to shoot." Morrison stared at her for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he mounted his horse and gathered his reins. "This is your last chance, Mrs. Mackenzie. The next offer might not be so generous." "There won't be a next offer. This land stays in the Mackenzie family." As Morrison and his men rode away, Sarah remained on the porch with the shotgun until they disappeared over the hill. Only then did she allow herself to tremble. Inside the cabin, she found Billy and Emma huddled together at the kitchen table, their faces frightened and confused. "Mama, was that man going to hurt us?" Emma whispered. Sarah knelt and gathered both children into her arms. "No, sweetheart. Mama won't let anyone hurt you." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew that Morrison would be back, and next time, he might not be so concerned about maintaining appearances. She needed Sheriff Brennan to return soon, because the feeling was growing stronger by the hour that her family was running out of time. What Sarah didn't know was that Brennan was at that very moment racing back toward town with evidence that would bring down Morrison's entire operation. But Morrison had plans of his own, and the next few hours would determine whether justice or corruption would prevail in Copper Valley. The real trail was finally becoming clear, but it led through dangerous territory where one wrong step could mean death for anyone brave enough to follow it. And tomorrow would bring a confrontation that would shake the valley to its very foundations. Sheriff Brennan rode into Copper Valley as the sun reached its peak, his horse's hooves raising small clouds of dust on the main street. He'd taken a circuitous route back to town, staying off the main roads and keeping to the rocky terrain where tracks would be harder to follow. The evidence he'd gathered from the Henderson place was safely tucked in his saddlebags, but he knew Morrison's men wouldn't be far behind. The town was unusually quiet for midday. A few shopkeepers swept their porches, and Mrs. Patterson hung laundry behind the boarding house. But most folks seemed to be staying indoors. Word had a way of traveling fast in small communities, and Brennan suspected that news of his investigation was already making the rounds. He tied his horse in front of the sheriff's office and was surprised to find Deputy Harrison waiting for him inside. Harrison was a young man, barely 25, with honest eyes and a nervous disposition that made him terrible at poker, but excellent at following orders. "Sheriff," Harrison said, jumping to his feet, "I'm glad you're back. There's been some folks asking about you." "What kind of folks?" "Frank Morrison stopped by about an hour ago. Said he wanted to discuss some missing cattle with you." He seemed agitated. Brennan hung his hat on the peg behind his desk and began unloading the evidence from his saddlebags. "Did he say anything else?" "Well, he asked a lot of questions about where you'd gone this morning, and he wanted to know if you'd been out to the Mackenzie place again." Harrison watched as Brennan spread the branded hides across his desk. "Sheriff, what's all this?" "Evidence that's going to put some very dangerous people behind bars." Brennan picked up one of the hides, pointing to the altered brand. "Look at this, Harrison. See how the original Circle M has been changed to look like a lazy S? This is professional work. Someone with a lot of experience altering brands." Harrison studied the hide carefully. "But Sheriff Morton said the Mackenzie Ranch was where they were changing the brands." "Sheriff Morton was either incompetent or corrupt. Maybe both." Brennan pulled out Tom Mackenzie's hidden notes and spread them on the desk beside the physical evidence. "Tom Mackenzie wasn't involved in cattle rustling, Deputy. He was investigating it." and he was murdered to keep him quiet. Harrison's eyes widened as he read through the notes. This implicates half the prominent men in the valley, including Frank Morrison, who I just watched burn down the Henderson barn to destroy evidence. Morrison burned down the barn? But that's destruction of property, obstruction of justice. It's attempted murder, Brennan interrupted. He and his men chased me for 3 miles, shooting to kill. This isn't just about cattle theft anymore, Harrison. These men are willing to commit murder to protect their operation. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Brennan quickly gathered the evidence and locked it in the office safe before answering. A small, nervous-looking man stood on the threshold, his hat clutched in his hands. Brennan recognized him as Pete Williams, who worked at the telegraph office. "Sheriff Brennan? I have a message for you. Came in from the territorial capital about an hour ago." Brennan took the telegram and read it quickly. His expression grew grim as he absorbed the contents. "Bad news?" Harrison asked. "The territorial governor has received a complaint about my conduct. Someone's claiming I'm harassing honest citizens and reopening cases that have already been properly resolved." Brennan folded the telegram and put it in his pocket. "I'm being ordered to cease all investigation into the Mackenzie case and report to the territorial capital within the week." Who would file such a complaint? Someone with enough political influence to get the governor's attention. Someone who wants me out of Copper Valley before I can expose the truth. Harrison looked troubled. "What are you going to do?" Before Brennan could answer, another visitor appeared at the door. This time it was Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow who ran the general store. Her face was flushed with excitement and worry. "Sheriff Brennan, I need to speak with you. It's about what I saw this morning." Brennan invited her inside and offered her a chair. Mrs. Henderson was known throughout the valley as a woman who minded her own business and rarely gossiped, so if she had something to say, it was worth hearing. "I was visiting my sister's grave this morning. She's buried in the old cemetery near the Henderson place," Mrs. Henderson began. "I saw smoke rising from the direction of the ranch, so I went to investigate. I thought maybe someone was in trouble." "What did you see?" "I saw Frank Morrison and 3 other men burning down Pete Henderson's old barn. And Sheriff, I saw something else." Mrs. Henderson leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Before they set the fire, I watched them carry out bundles of something, looked like animal hides. They loaded everything onto a wagon and drove it toward Morrison's ranch." Brennan exchanged glances with Harrison. "Mrs. Henderson, would you be willing to testify to what you saw?" The elderly woman's hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. "If it means getting justice for Tom Mackenzie and his family, yes. That boy was no cattle thief. He helped me fix my roof last spring, and he wouldn't take a penny for his work. Said neighbors should look after each other. Ma'am, I need to warn you that this could be dangerous. The people involved in this operation have already killed once, and they won't hesitate to do it again." Mrs. Henderson straightened her spine. "Sheriff, I've lived through Apache raids, droughts, and floods. I buried a husband and 3 children. I'm not about to be intimidated by Frank Morrison or anyone else." After Mrs. Henderson left, Brennan turned to his deputy. "Harrison, I need you to ride out to the Mackenzie place and bring Sarah and her children into town. Put them up in the hotel and keep them under guard." "You think Morrison will try something?" "I know he will. He's already threatened them once today, and now that we have witness testimony to go with the physical evidence, he's running out of options." Harrison strapped on his gun belt. "What about you, Sheriff? If Morrison has enough influence to get the territorial governor involved, then I'd better solve this case fast before I'm forced to abandon it." As Harrison rode out toward the Mackenzie Ranch, Brennan locked the office and made his way to the Copper Valley Hotel. He needed to send some telegrams of his own, to federal marshals he'd worked with in the past, to honest judges in other territories, to anyone who might be able to help him see justice done before political pressure forced him to back down. But as he walked down the main street, he was aware of eyes watching him from doorways and windows. Morrison had allies in this town, people who benefited from the cattle rustling operation or who were simply afraid to cross him. The game was entering its final phase, and Brennan knew that the next 24 hours would determine whether truth or corruption would prevail in Copper Valley. Meanwhile, at the Morrison Ranch, Frank Morrison was pacing his study like a caged animal. The safe containing his records of illegal cattle sales stood open behind him, and papers were scattered across his desk as he tried to figure out how much evidence the sheriff might have gathered. "Boss," one of his men said from the doorway, "Jake and Tom are back from the Henderson place. They say Brennan got away clean, and he had enough time to collect evidence before we torched the barn." Morrison slammed his fist on the desk. "How much does he know?" "Hard to say, but if he found those hides we left behind, then we're finished unless we act fast." Morrison moved to the window and stared out at his vast ranch. Thousands of acres built on a foundation of stolen cattle and murdered men. "What about the Mackenzie woman? Has she been dealt with?" "She refused to sell, threatened to shoot me if I didn't leave her property." Morrison's laugh was cold and humorless. "A widow with a shotgun thinks she can stand against us? How touching." He turned back to his men. "Tonight when the moon sets, we finish this. The sheriff, the woman, and anyone else who stands in our way." "What about the children?" "Accidents happen on the frontier. Fires mostly. Such a tragedy when an entire family perishes in a blaze." As Morrison's men prepared for their final assault, Sarah Mackenzie was packing essential belongings into a worn carpet bag. Deputy Harrison had arrived an hour ago with Sheriff Brennan's message, and despite her reluctance to leave her home, she knew he was right about the danger. "Mama, why can't we stay?" Emma asked, clutching her rag doll. "Because Sheriff Brennan thinks we'll be safer in town for a few days," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice calm. "It's just until he catches the bad men who hurt Papa." Billy appeared in the doorway, his face set with determination that reminded Sarah painfully of Tom. "I could stay and guard the ranch, Mama. I'm not afraid." "I know you're not, sweetheart, but I need you to help me take care of Emma." As they prepared to leave, Sarah took one last look around the cabin that had been her home for 8 years. Every piece of furniture, every dish, every faded curtain held memories of the life she and Tom had built together. But those memories would have to sustain her through the trials ahead, because she was about to learn that sometimes the price of justice is everything you hold dear. And sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to risk joining them. The final confrontation was coming, and Sarah Mackenzie would discover that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right even when you're terrified of the consequences. Tomorrow would bring gunfire and revelation, truth and tragedy. But tonight, for the last time, the Mackenzie family would sleep under their own roof, dreaming of a future where justice finally prevailed in Copper Valley. The moon was nothing more than a silver crescent hanging low in the star-filled sky when Frank Morrison and his men rode out from the ranch. They moved like shadows across the valley floor, their horses' hooves muffled with strips of cloth, their faces grim with deadly purpose. Morrison had chosen his crew carefully. Jake Thornton, a gunfighter from Texas with no conscience and faster hands than most men had a right to. Carlos Mendez, who could track a man across solid rock and kill him without making a sound. And Tom Bradley, a drifter who'd burned down 3 homesteads in Kansas for the right price. These weren't ordinary ranch hands. They were killers, and tonight they had orders to make sure Sheriff Brennan and the Mackenzie family never saw another sunrise. "Remember," Morrison said as they approached the outskirts of Copper Valley, "this has to look like an accident, a tragic fire that claimed the lives of a grieving widow and her children. The sheriff's death will be ruled a separate incident. Maybe he was investigating reports of the fire when the outlaws shot him." "What about witnesses?" Jake asked, his hand resting casually on his gun. "There won't be any. Mrs. Henderson has outlived her usefulness, and Deputy Harrison is young and inexperienced. He'll believe whatever story we tell him." They split up at the edge of town. Jake and Tom would handle the hotel where the Mackenzie family was staying, while Morrison and Carlos would deal with Sheriff Brennan. The plan was simple, brutal, and foolproof. Or so Morrison thought. What he didn't know was that Sheriff Brennan had spent the evening preparing for exactly this kind of attack. The lawman had positioned himself in the shadows across from the hotel, his rifle loaded and ready, waiting for Morrison to make his move. Brennan had also sent telegrams to federal marshals in 3 neighboring territories, detailing the evidence he'd gathered and requesting immediate assistance. Even if Morrison succeeded in killing him tonight, the truth about the cattle rustling operation would survive. At the hotel, Sarah Mackenzie lay awake in the narrow bed she shared with Emma, listening to her daughter's peaceful breathing while her mind raced with worry. Billy slept on a cot near the window, his small body tense even in sleep. The boy had inherited his father's instincts, and Sarah could see that he sensed the danger surrounding them. A soft scratching sound at the window made Sarah's blood freeze. She reached for the small pistol Sheriff Brennan had given her finger finding the trigger as she strained to see through the darkness. The scratching came again, followed by the almost inaudible sound of the window latch being manipulated from outside. Sarah slipped out of bed and moved silently to where Billy slept. She placed her hand gently over his mouth and whispered directly into his ear, "Wake up, but don't make a sound. Take Emma into the bathroom and lock the door. Don't come out no matter what you hear." Billy's eyes snapped open, instantly alert. He nodded once and carefully lifted his sleeping sister, carrying her toward the small bathroom at the back of the hotel room. Sarah positioned herself behind the overturned mattress, using it as cover while she aimed the pistol at the window. Her hands were steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. Tom had taught her to shoot, and she learned well. The window slid open with barely a whisper of sound. A dark figure began to climb through, moving with the careful precision of a professional killer. Sarah held her breath, waiting for the right moment. When the intruder was halfway through the window, she fired. The gunshot shattered the night silence, and the man screamed as the bullet tore through his shoulder. He tumbled backward out of the window, crashing into the alley below. "Jake's been hit," a voice shouted from outside. "Forget him," came another voice. "Fire the building." Sarah heard the sound of glass breaking as someone hurled a burning bottle through the downstairs window. Within seconds, she could smell smoke and see the orange glow of flames beginning to spread through the hotel's lower floor. She ran to the bathroom door. "Billy, we have to go. The building's on fire." The boy emerged carrying Emma, who was now awake and crying with fear. "Mama, what's happening?" "Bad men are trying to hurt us, sweetheart, but we're going to be okay." Sarah led them to the room's main door, pressing her ear against the wood to listen for sounds in the hallway. She could hear footsteps. Someone was coming up the stairs. "This way," she whispered, guiding them toward the window that the gunman had used. It opened onto a narrow balcony that connected to the building next door. As they climbed out onto the balcony, Sarah could see the fire spreading rapidly through the hotel's wooden structure. The entire first floor was already engulfed in flames, and smoke was beginning to pour from the windows below them. "Jump to the next building," Sarah told Billy. "I'll hand Emma to you." The boy leaped across the narrow gap between buildings, landing safely on the neighboring roof. Sarah passed Emma across, then made the jump herself just as the hotel balcony began to collapse behind them. From their position on the roof, they could see armed men in the alley below, searching for their bodies in the wreckage. But they could also see something else. Sheriff Brennan emerging from the shadows with his rifle raised. "Drop your weapons," Brennan shouted. "You're under arrest." Instead of surrendering, the men opened fire. Muzzle flashes lit up the night as bullets flew in both directions. Sarah pulled her children away from the edge of the roof, shielding them with her body as the gunfight erupted below. Meanwhile, Frank Morrison had been making his way toward the sheriff's office when the sound of gunfire erupted from the direction of the hotel. He cursed under his breath. The plan was supposed to be quiet, surgical. Now half the town would be awakened by the noise. He found Deputy Harrison running toward the sound of the shooting, still buttoning his shirt and carrying his gun belt in his hand. "Deputy," Morrison called out, "thank God you're here. I was riding into town when I heard gunshots. It sounds like it's coming from the hotel." "The Mackenzie family is staying there," Harrison said, his young face pale with worry. "I have to help them." "I'll come with you. We'll need all the help we can get." Harrison didn't notice the cold smile on Morrison's face as they hurried through the dark streets. The young deputy was walking into a trap, but Morrison would make sure his death looked heroic. A lawman killed in the line of duty while trying to stop a gang of outlaws. Back at the gunfight, Sheriff Brennan had taken cover behind a water trough and was systematically picking off Morrison's men. His years of experience as an Army scout showed in the way he moved, always staying in shadow, always finding the best position for his next shot. Tom Bradley tried to flank him but ran directly into Brennan's line of fire. The outlaw's career ended with a single rifle shot that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Jake Thornton, wounded but still dangerous, attempted to escape by running toward the livery stable. Brennan's second shot dropped him face first into the dusty street, his gun spinning away into the darkness. That left Carlos Mendez, who had disappeared into the maze of alleys behind the burning hotel. Brennan knew better than to pursue a man like Carlos in unfamiliar territory at night. Instead, he called out to the families who were emerging from their homes to fight the fire. "Form a bucket brigade. Save what buildings you can." The people of Copper Valley responded with the kind of community spirit that had built the frontier. Men, women, and children worked together, passing buckets of water from the well to the burning hotel. They couldn't save the building, but they prevented the fire from spreading to the rest of the town. As dawn broke over the valley, the immediate crisis was over. The hotel was a smoking ruin, but the Mackenzie family was safe. Two of Morrison's men were dead, one was wounded and in custody, and Carlos Mendez had vanished into the wilderness. But Frank Morrison himself was nowhere to be found. Sarah climbed down from the roof with her children, all of them covered in soot but unharmed. Sheriff Brennan met them in the street, his face grim with the knowledge that the fight wasn't over yet. "Where's Morrison?" Sarah asked. "Gone. But he'll be back. Men like him don't give up easily." "What happens now?" Brennan looked around at the gathered townspeople, honest folks who had seen their community terrorized by corruption and violence. Many of them were learning for the first time about the extent of Morrison's criminal operation. "Now we finish what your husband started," Brennan said. "We bring Frank Morrison to justice, and we make sure the truth about Tom Mackenzie is known throughout this territory." As the sun rose higher, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson, the real battle for Copper Valley was just beginning. Morrison might have escaped, but he'd lost his anonymity, his men, and his safe haven in the community. The final confrontation was still to come, and it would determine whether justice or corruption would ultimately prevail in this small corner of the American frontier. But Sarah Mackenzie had already won the most important victory. Her children were alive, her husband's name would be cleared, and the truth would finally see the light of day. Sometimes that's all the justice a person can hope for, and sometimes it's enough. Frank Morrison crouched in the abandoned mine shaft 3 miles north of Copper Valley, his expensive clothes torn and dirty, his face haggard with exhaustion and rage. The carefully constructed empire he'd built over 15 years of cattle rustling had crumbled in a single night. But Morrison wasn't the type of man to accept defeat gracefully. If he was going down, he'd take Sheriff Brennan and the Mackenzie family with him. He'd managed to salvage one thing from his ranch before fleeing, a leather satchel containing enough gold coins to hire a dozen gunfighters. Money could still buy him revenge, even if it couldn't buy him freedom. Meanwhile, in Copper Valley, Sheriff Brennan was coordinating the largest manhunt the territory had seen in years. Federal marshals had arrived from 3 neighboring counties, bringing with them tracking dogs and experienced lawmen who specialized in hunting fugitives. But it was Sarah Mackenzie who provided the crucial information that would lead to Morrison's capture. "Sheriff," she said, approaching Brennan as he studied maps of the surrounding terrain, "I remember something Tom mentioned in his notes. He wrote about seeing Morrison's men using the old Black Rock mine as a meeting place." Brennan looked up sharply. "Black Rock mine? That's been abandoned for years. Tom said it was perfect for hiding stolen cattle because there were underground chambers large enough to hold dozens of animals. If Morrison is still in the area, he'd go somewhere familiar, somewhere he felt safe." Brennan rolled up the map. "Mrs. Mackenzie, you might have just solved this case." Within an hour, a posse of 20 men was riding toward Black Rock Mine. Sheriff Brennan led the group, flanked by Federal Marshal Robert Hayes and Deputy Harrison, who had insisted on coming despite his youth and inexperience. They approached the mine from multiple directions, surrounding the area to prevent escape. The mine entrance was hidden in a rocky outcropping that provided natural concealment, but Brennan's experienced eye spotted the signs of recent occupation: fresh horse tracks, disturbed vegetation, and the faint smell of a cooking fire. "Morrison!" Brennan called out, his voice echoing off the rocky walls. "This is Sheriff Brennan. You're surrounded. Come out with your hands up." The response was a rifle shot that ricocheted off the rocks near Brennan's head. "I should have killed you that first day," Morrison's voice shouted from deep within the mine. "You and that interfering widow. It's over, Morrison. Your operation is finished. Your men are dead or captured, and the whole territory knows what you've done. Maybe so, but I can still make sure you don't live to see me hang." More gunshots echoed from the mine, forcing the posse to take cover behind rocks and trees. Morrison had chosen his position well. The narrow entrance to the mine created a natural bottleneck that would be difficult to assault directly. But Marshal Hayes had dealt with desperate fugitives before. "Sheriff, is there another way into that mine?" According to the old survey maps, there should be a ventilation shaft about 200 yards up the hill, but it might be blocked after all these years. "It's worth checking. Take half the men and circle around. Keep Morrison pinned down here while we find that back entrance." Brennan selected 10 men and began the difficult climb up the rocky hillside. The terrain was treacherous, with loose stones and hidden crevices that could break a man's leg if he wasn't careful. They found the ventilation shaft exactly where the maps indicated, partially concealed by overgrown brush and fallen rocks. It would be a tight fit, but a determined man could squeeze through. "Deputy Harrison," Brennan said, "you stay here with half the men. If Morrison tries to escape through this shaft, you stop him." "What about you, Sheriff?" "I'm going down there to end this." Brennan lowered himself into the narrow shaft, using a rope to control his descent into the darkness below. The air was stale and musty, filled with the echoes of his own breathing and the distant sound of Morrison's continued gunfire. He emerged into a large underground chamber that had once housed mining equipment. Wooden support beams creaked ominously overhead, and the floor was littered with rusty tools and broken machinery. Following the sound of gunfire, Brennan made his way through a series of connecting tunnels until he could see light ahead. The main entrance where Morrison had taken cover behind an overturned minecart. The outlaw was so focused on the posse outside that he didn't hear Brennan approaching from behind until the sheriff's voice cut through the darkness. "Drop your weapon, Morrison." Morrison spun around, his rifle swinging toward Brennan, but the sheriff was ready. His pistol was already drawn, aimed steady at Morrison's chest. "Go ahead," Morrison snarled. "Shoot me in the back like a coward." "I'm not a coward, and you're not worth the bullet," Brennan replied. "Drop the rifle and come out peaceful. You'll get a fair trial." "Fair trial?" Morrison laughed bitterly. "From the same people I've been stealing from for 15 years? They'll hang me before I ever see a courtroom." "Maybe, but that's their choice to make, not mine." For a moment, the two men stared at each other in the dim light filtering through the mine entrance. Then Morrison's face twisted with rage and desperation. "I should have killed Tom Mackenzie the first time he started asking questions." "You did kill him, and you tried to destroy his family to cover up your crimes. That righteous fool thought he could bring me down, thought he could protect this valley from men like me." Morrison's grip tightened on his rifle. "But I showed him what happens to heroes in the real world. You showed him what happens when evil men think they can't be touched by justice. But Tom Mackenzie is dead, and you're still here facing the consequences." Morrison raised his rifle with desperate speed, but Brennan was faster. The sheriff's shot echoed through the mine like thunder, and Morrison's weapon clattered to the rocky floor as the outlaw crumpled beside it. Brennan approached carefully, keeping his gun trained on the fallen man. Morrison was still breathing, but the bullet had pierced his lung. He wouldn't survive long without medical attention. "Sheriff!" Morrison gasped, blood frothing at his lips. "The money! Hidden in the mine! Enough gold to buy whatever you want." "I don't want your blood money, Morrison. Everyone has a price. Not everyone." Brennan knelt beside the dying man. "Tom Mackenzie didn't, his widow doesn't, and neither do I." Morrison's eyes went glassy as his breathing became shallow and labored. You think you've won? There are others, other operations. You can't stop them all." "Maybe not, but I stopped you, and sometimes that's enough." Frank Morrison died as he had lived, bitter, unrepentant, and alone. When Brennan emerged from the mine carrying Morrison's body, the assembled posse erupted in cheers. But the sheriff felt no joy in the victory, only a grim satisfaction that justice had finally been served. The ride back to Copper Valley was solemn and quiet. Word of Morrison's death spread quickly, and by the time the posse reached town, most of the population had gathered in the main street to witness the end of the cattle rustling operation that had plagued their community for so long. Sarah Mackenzie was waiting with her children when Brennan dismounted in front of the crowd. Her face was calm, but her eyes held a mixture of relief and sadness. "It's over," she asked quietly. "It's over. Morrison's dead. His operation is finished, and the truth about your husband will be known throughout the territory. Billy stepped forward, his young face serious. Does this mean Papa's name is cleared? More than cleared, son. Your father is a hero. The evidence we found proves that he died trying to protect this entire valley from criminals. The crowd that had once shunned the Mackenzie family now pressed forward to offer their apologies and support. Mrs. Henderson embraced Sarah with tears in her eyes. The banker who had refused her credit now promised to extend any loan she needed. Even the preacher who had made the family feel unwelcome at church invited them to return to their rightful place in the community. But it was the words of old Pete Hawkins from the livery stable that meant the most to Sarah. Mrs. Mackenzie, the grizzled man said, removing his hat respectfully, I want you to know that I never believed them stories about Tom. He was the finest man I ever knew, and I'm ashamed that I didn't speak up for him when it mattered. Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. That means more to me than you know. As the crowd began to disperse, Sheriff Brennan approached Sarah one last time. Mrs. Mackenzie, there's something else. We found Morrison's records hidden in the mine. According to his books, he owes your family compensation for the cattle he stole over the years. It's enough money to rebuild your ranch and provide for your children's education. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. Sheriff, I don't know how to thank you. You already have. You had faith in your husband when no one else did. You stood up to Morrison when he tried to intimidate you. And you helped us find the evidence that brought him to justice. Brennan tipped his hat. Tom Mackenzie would be proud of the woman he married. 3 months later, the Mackenzie ranch was thriving again. New cattle grazed in the pastures. The buildings had been repaired and expanded, and Sarah had hired 2 reliable hands to help with the work. Billy had returned to school, where his teacher made sure every student knew that his father had been a hero who died defending their community. Emma played in the yard with the neighborhood children, no longer the outcast she had been during those dark weeks after Tom's death. And Sarah? She stood on her porch each evening, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and crimson, knowing that justice had finally prevailed in Copper Valley. Sheriff Brennan had been reassigned to another territory, but his work in exposing the cattle rustling operation had earned him a commendation from the territorial governor and the respect of honest lawmen throughout the West. On his last day in Copper Valley, he stopped by the Mackenzie ranch to say goodbye. Will you be all right here? He asked Sarah as they stood by Tom's grave, now marked with a proper headstone that bore the inscription, Thomas Mackenzie, loving husband, father, and hero. We'll be fine, Sarah replied. This is our home, and now everyone knows that we have a right to be here. And if any other trouble comes along, Sarah smiled, her hand resting on the pistol she now carried whenever she left the ranch. I think I've learned how to take care of myself and my children. Brennan nodded, satisfied. Tom Mackenzie chose well when he married you, Mrs. Mackenzie. And this community chose well when they got you as their sheriff, even if it was only for a short time. As Brennan rode away toward his next assignment, Sarah remained by her husband's grave for a few more minutes. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the sounds of her children's laughter and the lowing of cattle in the distance. We did it, Tom, she whispered. We cleared your name and saved our home. The truth finally came out, just like you always said it would. The sun set over Copper Valley, painting the sky in brilliant colors that seemed to promise better days ahead. And for the first time since Tom's death, Sarah Mackenzie felt truly at peace. Justice had been served, the truth had prevailed, and sometimes, just sometimes, that's exactly the ending a story deserves. The story of Sarah Mackenzie and Sheriff Jack Brennan reminds us that justice isn't always swift, and it isn't always easy. But when good people refuse to let lies become truth, when they stand up to corruption even at great personal cost, justice can prevail even in the darkest circumstances. Tom Mackenzie died because he refused to let criminals destroy his community. Sarah Mackenzie survived because she refused to let her husband's sacrifice be meaningless. And Sheriff Brennan succeeded because he understood that a badge means nothing without the courage to do what's right. In our modern world, we still face situations where it's easier to look the other way than to stand up for truth. We still encounter bullies who think their power makes them untouchable, and we still have to choose between what's convenient and what's right. The frontier may be gone, But the choice between courage and cowardice, between truth and lies, between justice and corruption, that choice is as real today as it was in the dusty streets of Copper Valley. So the next time you're faced with a difficult decision, ask yourself, what would Sarah Mackenzie do? What would Tom Mackenzie do? What would an honest sheriff do when the easy path led away from justice? The answer might just change your life and the lives of everyone around you. If this story of courage, truth, and frontier justice moved you, let us know in the comments. Have you ever had to stand up for what's right when everyone else was looking the other way? Have you ever been misjudged by a community that didn't know the whole truth? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories for more tales of courage, justice, and the human spirit that built America. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode, and remember, every like and share helps us continue bringing these incredible stories of the American frontier to life. Until next time, keep fighting for truth, keep standing up for justice, and keep believing that sometimes the good guys really do win in the end. This has been Wild West Stories, where legends never die and justice always finds a way.